Hello, pod smashers of the internet, and welcome to another episode of
Itchy Bit Pod Smash,
Where Gaming Goes to Grab a Beer. We are your hosts.
Penguin and Termite. I'm Penguin.
I am Termite, and we are a weekly video game podcast smashing together ideas that you care about with video games.
That's right. And tonight we are in honor of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. Wonderlands coming out this week. We are talking about fantasy video games, and in particular, we're talking about the legacy of D&D and its influence on games trying to chase after that D&D goodness. So we will break down what we're thinking about that, but before we do that, we are Where Gaming Goes to Grab a Beer, so we are going to talk about what beer we are drinking.
I am drinking Basic City IPA 6. It's Sixth Lord IPA. I may have had this on the show before, and I cannot remember. But Basic City is a brewery that's in Waynesboro, which is right outside of my neighborhood. It's about a 30-minute drive or so. I actually popped in there one night. This is a New World IPA, hop-centric and Citra Dank by order of the Sixth Lord. That's what it's called.
Wow,
that's
an awesome name.
It is, right? Yeah, it's pretty sweet. So it's a ridiculously good IPA. It's just solid. Like, I would drink this every single day. Just it's light-bodied. Like, I love my Dogfish Head 90 Minute, but 90 Minute is like drinking a loaf of bread, and this is like that in the same flavor profile, but it's a little light on the everything, except it's not a low-calorie light either. So it's not like slightly mighty. It's a meaty, middle-of-the-road, standard run-of-the-mill IPA, and it's solid quality. Good balance. I love it. So if you ever see Basic City Sixth Lord in stores, pick one up because it's awesome.
Nice. This beer that I have is so very pastel. I'm like now just sort of realizing what the can looks like, and I'm just like, wow, this is
well, it's that time of year.
Else. This is I got this from our friend of the show, Ryan. We were hanging out with them, and he said that he had this beer and that's been in his fridge for a while. I don't know what a while is. And he said, I'm not sure I want to drink it. It's been in there that long. And I said, I'll drink it. In fact, I'll drink it on the podcast. And I'll specifically, if I get halfway through the show and start vomiting, I'll make sure to say, curse you, Ryan. and leave that in. So anyways.
You are never one to turn down free beer.
Absolutely.
So that makes sense.
So if he didn't want to drink it, I said, I will drink it for you. And I will do so publicly. This is called Ghosts or Roses. It is a ghost style ale with Syrah grapes and aged in oak foeders. So yeah, it's by the brewery, and I'm gonna give it a shot. And if it here we go. I'll read the thing. It says ghosts are red. Oh, ghosts are red. It's called Ghosts Are Red. I'm dumb. I called it Ghosts Are Roses. And I don't know how that I inserted that. That's really funny. Ghosts Are Red. It's still funny. It's still a pun. Is a stylish, funky, crisp, and tart ghost ale inspired by the soft sweetness of a rosé wine. Satisfyingly complex from the time spent in oak foeders, this refreshing wheat-based ale has hints of coriander spicing and a light saltiness to complement the soft tartness. So I hope I get any of that and all of that because it sounds delicious, and hopefully it's not just like rotten grape death that I'm about to drink. So we'll give it a shot and see how it goes.
And the brewery is spelled Bruery, and I've actually heard of them for the first time because they did a collaboration with Dogfish Head and created a line of beers that were awesome that I cannot remember.
I had one from the
bottle
brewery as well fairly recently, I think, on the show, but I don't remember what it was. So I like them.
Yeah.
They're good.
What do you think of this one? You just took a sip.
It's
How is it?
It's good. It's exactly what I want from like a sour. But it doesn't taste like it's spoiled at all. So I'm into it. It's very good. I like it. It's only 5% alcohol though, so that would be my biggest criticism: is make it boozy.
It's not boozy enough.
Make it boozier, boys. All right. I think that means we can talk about whatever it is you had in mind to talk about.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things. Like, we are in the podcasting space. We did some collaborations with The Flock, which is a fellow Virginian video game centric podcast. And we've had a couple of brush-ins with like the bigwigs, if you will. One of them was Kind of Funny's Greg Miller put out a solicitation for us. I am going to talk about that. But I have two things to talk about. This is the first one. It does sting a little bit.
Rub it in the wound, man.
Yeah, but I want to talk about it with our audience because I think this is a really cool idea. So Greg Miller, through Kind of Funny, has this initiative to want to like raise voice or like bolster voice, use his platform and his like notoriety or whatever to kind of bring up people who get overlooked or like the lower, smaller, just starting out podcasters or YouTubers or Twitch streamers. And through that initiative, there was a contest. It was like, hey, we're going to pick out like 4 slots and Greg Miller's going to be on your show. And then on Kind of Funny's platforms, they'll promote that for you and you get a chance to talk to Greg Miller. I've been following Greg Miller since his IGN days. So of course I was ridiculously starstruck at even the notion of talking to him 1-on-1, 2-to-1, however you want to talk about it. So I threw our email into a pool and we got picked. It was amazing. I got an email directly from Greg Miller asking us, are we available on this day? He said, however, these time slots are filling really fast. You have to be quick to respond. And I got that email 3 hours later. So I did respond with some excitement. I CC'd Penguin here just so he would be aware of it. And basically just like, yay, I got picked. This is awesome. We are available at this time. And then he responded back to both of us. Unfortunately, that slot had been chosen. We were too slow kind of thing. Like we were too slow in the draw. So I imagine he got like thousands of applicants and then like they chose however many email addresses and then had to figure out like how to time slot those things. So I don't really fault him for that. But
no, it was disappointing. I felt really excited at first, like, yay, it actually happened, because you said you put our name in there, and I was like,
it's not gonna
happen, right? Yeah. I mean, we worked hard to give we had to give a 2-sentence pitch as to what we'd talk about or something, and you and I brainstormed ones that we think we liked, and we landed on one that we thought was catchy.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I completely forgot about that entire process. You're right. There was a Google form that we filled out that had like these kind of open-ended questions. What would you want to talk to Greg Miller about? And it was a chance for us to really like think about a smart topic that we would want to talk to Greg Miller about that's both appealing to our audience and might be appealing to him, and like think about the collaboration. And I imagine the people with the better write-ups are the ones that got selected. So maybe you and I put our thoughts together and we actually did this. Like maybe it is our fault that we got picked, That's cool.
I mean, yeah. That is. I hope so. I hope that's exactly why they had you fill out a form in the first place, as opposed to just put your name in. It sounds easier to put your name in a hat. Like, why waste people's time? I guess maybe, I don't know. Whatever. Why waste their time if they're not like using that as a criteria upon which to?
Yeah, it makes total sense to like kind of vet the responses, so you don't just like end up summoning someone who wants to have a one-on-one chat with you and has no podcast at all. They just want their time in the sun.
Exactly. So I think that, maybe we have another chance. Maybe we submit it again with the same prompt, or maybe we come up with another one. And maybe we have another shot at it in the future down the road. But it was disappointing that, like, I think I said to you, I was really ticked off that, like, they didn't give the option to select the kind of reach out that you would want, right? Like a phone call you probably would have caught a phone call, but say love you.
Oh, absolutely, I would have.
Yeah. It is what it is. And, as I tell my son, if you're disappointed, you find something else to do.
That's a great segue into my second point that I wanted to address, which is also a brush up against the greater podcasting community. We got tickets to go see Sacred Symbols 200 live in Virginia. And if you don't know what that is, that's Colin Moriarty, which used to be Greg Miller's cohort before they had a huge fallout and a big rift. Now Colin Moriarty, formerly IGN, has started his own PlayStation podcast and a Patreon, which happens to be the single highest grossing video game podcast on Patreon, period. And it's called Sacred Symbols, and it is PlayStation centered. And they're having their episode 200 live in Virginia at the National in April. And you and I scored tickets for us. It's my treat. We're both going. I just told Dan, like, I'm going to buy these tickets. Make yourself available. I'm going to try. Because last time he did this, it was in Pennsylvania, and it sold out in 30 seconds. So I knew it was going to be nuts. And I was like, whatever, I'm going to try to get these tickets. Well, I got some. I got 2 tickets. So the 2 of us, Penguin and Termite, we're going to meet up in Richmond. We're going to go to Jack Brown's. We'll stuff our faces full of amazing burgers and craft beer. And then we will get over to the National, and we will be amidst our kinfolk in the podcasting gaming industry sphere, among audience members who are also fans of these folks. And we will be able to be in the live audience of Sacred Symbols 200.
Making it rain with our business cards. No.
We definitely need to like brush up on getting over that awkward hump where you're like, hey, we have a podcast too. And like, we need to wear our shirts and like kind of talk about things and try to grow us a little bit. I think this is a good mingling opportunity. Maybe we can
throw ourselves at Colin Moriarty, get him to come on our show, and then play Colin and Greg off each other and exploit their drama.
That might actually like hurt too much.
No,
That's
no,
a
no,
deeply
no.
personal rift between the two of them.
Parent trap them. We parent trap them. The whole point is to parent trap them, get them back together on our show, and then we do a 4-way. We do a 4-way show.
That would be unbelievably like nuclear blast on the internet in the gaming industry if that happened. That's how big that would be if we could pull that off.
All we have to do is throw ourselves at them and parent trap them. So
that's it.
We'll have to watch that movie a bunch. The Lindsay Lohan version, obviously, until we figure out how we can do it to Greg and
I like it.
Colin. All right, cool. Yeah, no, I'm excited about it.
It's gonna be great.
All right, I think that's good. That's all the good banter. Thanks for bringing all that stuff up. Obviously, you and I are in the throes of Elden Ringdom right now, and we've had too many conversations about it even before the game came out. So we don't necessarily bore our audience with it, though. I'm certain it will come up in an episode about fantasy games. But yeah, do you have anything you want to share about your experience so far? I'll give you a chance to share about just about.
Well, I mean, there's the obvious lack of difficulty in this game somehow. It's not super difficult. I'm not having a hard time with it, but I'm seeing a ton of people on Twitter struggle with it. I have a neighbor here who is struggling with it, and I don't understand what I'm doing differently than what I feel like I'm playing it in a way that's like not normal, or like I'm not doing it right because it's not punishing. I've not been frustrated at all.
You're not doing anything that you shouldn't be doing, right? You're not.
I guess I don't know.
Even if you were, if they're, my philosophy with Bloodborne was if the boss is bugged, it's bugged, and if I can use that bug to beat it, I'll beat it. There are bosses in Dark Souls where you can tuck yourself behind a wall, shoot it in the face with an arrow over and over and over and over and over and over again to kill it without taking a single piece of damage. So
I did that in Elden Ring. I don't remember what. It was a big enemy, and it like held up. It got caught up in something, and I was like, hee, I'm gonna blast you with magic, and I'm not gonna get hit.
There's no gatekeepers here. You're doing a great job. You're utilizing the advantages you need to overcome difficult challenges, and you are just perhaps doing it a little bit smarter than others because you're relying on the community, like the game wants you to do, as opposed to people who are trying to raw dog it and getting their butts kicked. Or guess what? Maybe Termite, you're just better at games than you say you are.
Oh no, I'm complete trash at video games. I don't really put in hours. I haven't memorized boss patterns. I don't have parry window reflexes. I got none of that. I don't have time to get that stuff honed in.
You don't have time, and you're doing the strategies that work for you, which is maybe that's staying out of their range and blasting them with magic. There are bosses that deal with that, and if you are still beating them, like, you're doing fine because they have ways of dealing with you at range. So
I'm also ridiculously over-leveled because of an item duplication that allowed us to grind runes ridiculously fast.
Yeah,
so I'm
you would be at this level doing this stuff anyways, though. So
but it would have taken like 6 times as long, right?
Yeah, maybe, but doesn't matter. You are doing just fine, and you are better than you think you are. So.
Well, thank you for the words of encouragement, but I did not think that I am that great at games.
No, it's so selfish, though. This is all self-serving. I may be praising you and singing your praises, but it's because it's all reinforcing the notion that I was right all along, and that's all I care about is that I was right.
So, you were right. Okay, go to Twitter and search on the hashtag Elden Ring. And start building a spreadsheet of statistics of who is struggling and who is having a good time, an easy time.
I'm not saying that
and then we will come up with statistics that say it's difficult.
I'm not saying that everyone should play the game, and some people are going to be bad at the game, and that's fine. And for them, I offer, of course, help and extend a hand of friendship and assistance. But I know you, and that's what I'm saying. For you, I've been saying you're not going to have as hard a time with it as you think you're going to do. You are not going to find it as difficult as in your imagination it is. And you have to at least admit that I was somewhat right about that you had imagined it to be so much harder than it actually is. And even in the early game, you say you beat X boss at Y boss even before I dumped a bunch of runes on you with the duplication.
Right, it's true. Yeah. Well, one of them. Well, the first 2 bosses have items that severely handicap them. So if you know to get them, then runes grinding aside, that's
knowledge.
The cheese.
That's the point. The game's about knowledge. If you know the things, then you can do that. If you know the exploits, if you know the strategies, if you know where to get the items, if you know how to level up, if you know how to do things, you beat these games. They're games of knowledge, not skill.
I will determine that I am wrong if and only if I can do the same thing in Sekiro. If I play Sekiro and I also don't have a hard time, then I can say you are legitimately correct.
Sekiro is a different beast. Sekiro doesn't have nearly the amount of safety nets that Elden Ring has. No spirits,
Exactly.
no summons, no leveling up. So, I mean, yeah, I think you should play Sekiro because I think you'll have a fun time, and I think it's not as bad as that one. Neither is that one as bad.
That's the one I want to do the most.
That one
next,
is also
after this
objectively harder. Like,
I know,
I'll even
everyone...
admit the Sekiro is like, oh, woof. I mean, but granted, you'll still be able to get through the first couple bosses with some pretty silly cheese strategies. So if you want a cheese strategy, I'll look up the ones. If you want a cheese guide to Sekiro,
well, I'm just gonna follow PowerPix's trophy guide. So if they got links to it, I'm in.
Okay. I had to look for sources
yeah.
outside of PowerPix for assistance on that one. So, anyways, well, I'm glad you're having a good time. That's what it boils down to.
It's crazy. I'm addicted. That's all I want to do. You had to pry me off of it to get to this episode because I had a half-hour window of time. And I was like, I gotta get to the next thing.
You know, you and I recently we were having a conversation, and you were knocking the game for its graphics, which rightly so. It's not necessarily like it's got some textures, some hashtag basic textures. It was designed third party for multiple systems, including last gen, which I'll give it some credit for. But dude, their color palettes, man, like a game is lovely, like colors and gorgeous. And I trust
I'm
me,
in the yellow area.
I know
that I conquered a red area before that. Yeah. So yes, very colorful.
I know coming from like Horizon, maybe it's not as gorgeous because of just how, again, much more money that studio had. But coming from like Souls games, you know, like I have a certain level of expectation of the amount of black to expect in any of those games, and I've been pleasantly surprised. Not pleasantly surprised. It has met my expectations in regards to just how much more colorful and beautiful the game is. So that's definitely been striking to me.
Yeah.
Recently. So,
well, you and I are both not ones to be like bad graphics equal bad game.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, like we love Arceus despite the rightful criticism of its graphics. Like, yeah, Arceus is still awesome, but yeah.
I think it comes down kind of to expectations, right? Like, what should a studio be capable of versus. And so, you know, if you're thinking that, you know, if From Software were tied to one of the big three, you know, exclusive studio, tons of money, tons of assets
PlayStation,
and resources,
get on that. Do it.
Right. Then maybe, right? But, you know, I saw a good argument that, like, it may not have, you know, in regards to Arceus, that I do think applies to Elden Ring as well. And this is where we'll end, I guess, about this, the last bit of Elden Ring.
Yeah.
Someone made the argument that despite its graphics, you can't knock the game for its animations. Every single Pokemon has like brand new, unique animations that they've never had in other games because they all have to do things like sleep or whatever out in the open world. They all have like a
Pokemon Snap does that.
Of new animations, right? But are they using the same animations? I think people did the work and looked and determined that there were like brand new animations never been done before in Arceus.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a lot of work for 100 and something monsters. They were like, you know, Breath of the Wild only ever had like, you know, 20, 30, maybe 50 monsters. You can tell that they had to do a lot of work on all the models in Pokemon. And I think that that stands with Elden Ring as well, because like every single boss has, even though its skeleton might be based off of another mob, like it's got unique attack patterns and multiple unique like phases and attacks and stuff and models. And then same with your characters. Like there's hundreds and hundreds of weapons, many of them having the same obviously animations, but many having unique ones as well. So yeah, there's a lot of work that went into, I think, a lot of the animations and getting those right so that they don't clip or mess up or bug out. Like, yeah, that's probably accounted for a lot of the art team's efforts there. So cool. All right, I think let's skip favorite things because we're already 20 minutes in, so we can get to everyone's favorite segment, which is DLC. DLC stands for downloadable content. If you are sad that we skipped favorite things, don't worry. We literally just talked about some of our favorite things for the week. And
we did.
Downloadable content. This segment is a fun mini discussion, a sub discussion that may or may not have anything to do with our main topic. This one does. Since we're going to be talking a bit about D&D and tabletops, I wanted to play off of the idea of the critical roll. A critical roll is either the highest roll you can make on a 20-sided die or the lowest, which is going to be a 1 or a 20. A 1 would be a critical failure. A 20 would be a critical success. They are usually like extra, like good or bad, right? So like it's sometimes it's, you know, the greater than the sum of its parts, like it's more than just, you know, doing 20 damage times whatever multiplier you have. Sometimes a critical success is an extra, like you can't even break it, right? It has some of that extra zhuzh. And same with critical failure. You can't save yourself from a critical failure. So I wanted to ask you, in your experience in gaming, can you think of any times that you had a quote critical roll in a game where something just insanely lucky happened and you benefited from it. It could be a rare item dropped for you at like the beginning of the game. It could be just like a set of like physical, like the physics worked out perfectly for you, or what. Yeah, so that's my prompt. And if you can't think of any,
I think of a specific moment, but I can definitely throw out a solid category
sure, yeah.
of any. As a trophy hunter, every single time there is any trophy tied to a random number generator or RNG, when the luck just happens and it works in my favor, I am elated beyond any other thing that could possibly happen in a game.
Mhm.
And it's always like, I understand if you get like a critical hit and like you defeat a boss, like, okay, that's nothing compared to the elation that I experience when there's a very difficult achievement or trophy that pops either because of a glitch that I don't have to do the thing at all. It's free. That's amazing. Or if it has a super difficult way of unlocking that I happen to like RNG the thing and it worked for me in that one moment. When you talk about like physics or like real time rendering of physics, when things line up perfectly, that is awesome. And I also experience the same deep levels of frustration and anger when they don't work in my favor. You talk about the critical role being the worst and the best. The worst I experienced with Shadows of Mordor. I can experience that. I can articulate that very clearly, where you have to do a 3-hour setup to get an enemy to have all the correct conditions to drop a level 25 rune, and one of the conditions isn't met, or a teammate killed the thing and ruined it, and it dropped a level 20 rune instead, and I had to redo the 3-hour setup again. I was so furious, which is what I expected from software games to do to me, and Elden Ring has yet to do that, so there's that. But
I hope you don't run into like that one boss that just like, I mean,
as long as it doesn't require a 3-hour setup, I can handle it.
Yeah, touche. No, it usually rarely does, surprisingly. Elden Ring, though, I think is a little bit more forgiving with the checkpoints and stuff, though. Not to say most of the time the checkpoints are fine. It's very rarely anything more than like a 2-minute run back, and you can usually run past all the enemies in the other games. But every once in a while, there's some setups that are like, eh. But anyways, I would say that I have one example that happened in Elden Ring, like either today or yesterday. I was fighting. Have you gotten into fight any of the Magma Worms yet?
I ran by some, but I didn't fight them.
Okay, well, there's the Magma Worms. They have a very specific kind of moveset. They're actually they count as dragons. They drop dragon hearts, which allow you to
interesting. No, I did not run past these. There was a cluster of them.
Oh, no,
small and tiny.
No, not worm. WORM. Worm as in like dragon.
Oh, yeah, I fought one.
Yep. Okay, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So they have this one move where they kind of look like salamanders, right? And they have this one move where they kind of like whip around, intending to catch you if you're in melee range. Well, I had one do that. I was like, I was about to die, right? I had like no health left, and there was one. He did that, and I must have rolled a 20 because I basically avoided the actual damage hitbox of that attack and somehow ended up in his elbow, like not in like clipping through it, but like I was sandwiched between. He was like curled in such a way where I was kind of stuck there in his elbow, but I was within melee range. I had been like drinking my potion, so I didn't die, and I got the potion off. So I was like, well, I'm at full health and I'm right in melee range. Smack.
Nice.
I just wrecked him. So he positioned me perfectly, but I could see that the physics still moved me. So I got hit by the hitbox, just not whatever the damage just didn't register, I guess. So I was just like, he moved me perfectly into a spot where I could just wreck him, and things like that. I have moments like that in all of the games, right, where I just like by sheer luck beast moded my way through something, but I can't think of specific examples, but things like that where like the physics always work out for me are the ones that I like the successes on. But dude, I could tell you the amount of failures I've had, not necessarily in those games, but in every single game I have notoriously bad luck on like RNG. Like I just there have been
Returnal?
times. Returnal was I had some rough runs, some critical fails in Returnal. But I had even in my old like RPG days, like Diablo, or not older, in my old like MMO days and stuff like that, but like Diablo or World of Warcraft, there were multiple times where I'd be like, oh, finally that item dropped for me. Let me literally roll for it, because you roll, for the item in game to win it against your teammates. And some random druid first time in their raid would like roll for it and get like a 99, whereas I literally roll a 1. I think there was a time that I rolled a 1 on a staff or something, and I was like, I've been doing this for weeks now, and I still don't have the thing. So I have notoriously hard time gearing up in any system that has RNG. for reasons of luck. So we want to hear your critical roles in games, guys. We want to hear those times that luck just screws you over, or luck just kisses you on the cheek. Lady Luck, and you had something awesome or terrible happen as a result of good or bad luck in a video game, or in real life. Sure, why not tell us the times you had a critical success in real life? Yeah, we want to hear those thoughts and more. So, Termite, where can the Pod Smashers and other listeners of the internet share their critical role stories if they have them?
You can find us at 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website with links to all of our social media outlets, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and Twitter. So you can let us know what your critical roles are, what games have pushed all of your buttons, have done all of the things to infuriate or elate you. Let us know. We also have a Discord server. The link is all there, 80bitpodsmash.com. So go check us out. If you are listening to us by way of, say, YouTube or other non-podcast related places, you can find all of our podcast links, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Google Play, Apple Podcasts, etc., all at 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bitpodsmash.com. Go check it out.
Wow, 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 wow. All right, so that's DLC. Leads us to our main topic. We're going to be talking about fantasy games and the legacy of D&D, how those two things tie together, obviously. They are not necessarily, not all fantasy games are necessarily, inspired by or trying to be D&D, but there's a big crossover of games that do. So we'll be talking about that. We'll start with the fantasy portion of this. So as a literary genre and not a gameplay genre, right, we have to draw that distinction because we use the word genre interchangeably. Well, not interchangeably. We use the word genre to apply to both a set of gameplay characteristics, but we also refer to it as sort of a kind of setting and expected theme and sort of that all that literary stuff. Those can also, in fact, that's the original use of the word genre, and the video game industry kind of co-opted it to refer to as a set of gameplay rules as well. So as a literary genre, what would fantasy be described as, and why is it so often used as a video game setting?
Fantasy. Well, I always think of medieval fictional races based on mythology and folklore.
Yeah.
It's usually not technologically advanced. That's sci-fi, which is scientific science fiction, which is kind of fantasy of the future, right?
Sure, yeah, they two go hand in hand. A sci-fi fantasy usually
do.
is sort of but because they often share a lot of the same storytelling characteristics. But you're right, one sort of is tech-based and future-based, and one sort of is either mythological or fantasy, or sorry, the thing to define itself, mythological, magical, medieval, those kinds of things tend to be what we call fantasy. It's all Tolkien, right? It's not all Tolkien.
Well, I like Tolkien because that is the quintessential.
It is. He sort of
in our generation,
fantasy,
was it 1950s? When did Lord of the Rings come out?
It was after the war, I think.
But that would be in the 50s, I guess.
I think it would
45
be
is
late
when
40s,
the war ended.
50s,
yeah. Okay. But if you look at his influences or influences where they came from, things like race, dwarves, orcs, all that stuff, it was derived from mythology of various types, right? Roman,
1954
Greek.
For the record.
Oh, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, so but it was all he had to pull that stuff from somewhere, and granted, he added his own creativity to it.
Well, sure, Tolkien decided that he wanted to write. Basically, his whole conceit of this was he thought that England didn't have mythology. Granted, a ridiculous statement because King Arthur, and he even pulled from English and Celtic mythology in his creation of Lord of the Rings, but in his mind, he decided that England did not have a good enough mythology, and so he wanted to create one for England.
Yep.
And so, that's what Lord of the Rings was supposed to be.
When you talk about fantasy as a genre, you can go all the way back to ancient mythology.
I was gonna say Gilgamesh, bro. Yeah, the stories of the gods, the Greeks and the Romans. Yep. Yeah, those were effectively fantasy in many ways. They were contemporary fantasy for their time, but they were fantasy nonetheless. Because it's always magic, magic, gods, monsters, castles, knights, heroes, demons. It covers a broad category that touches on a lot of different genres, and then of course there's all the subgenres and blends, right? Urban fantasy, where it's kind of it's fantasy but in the real world. I think of you remember that movie with Will Smith, the that was
I Am Legend?
No, not that one. Bright. It was called Bright, I think. and it was like
I have no idea what you're talking about.
basically the entire
Okay.
thing was orcs are black people, right? Like it was like
Oh.
in a city, but it had like orcs and elves and fairies, and they drew a parallel between orcs and black people was basically
Wow.
what they were intended. And so of course like there was controversy around it because people were like, we're not orcs. Right? But then other people were like, yeah, but they're drawing a parallel. Yeah, so it was a controversy. It was, if you stripped all of that controversy away, the movie was enjoyable for what it was. But anyways,
but don't people criticize Tolkien for being racist with the way he represents?
I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Like the
Yeah.
whole idea of like, I mean, they're, for all intents and purposes, they're not, we call them the races of Middle Earth, right? But they're not races, you know, at least the way that we as humans understand race. They're more like different species of sentient beings, in the same way that like aliens would be, right? If they were real, or in in sci-fi they are. But still, you know, when you have like, oh, this is the dirty race that are evil and inherent to their core, and look at the characteristics of, I don't know, their skin and their teeth and their like bone structure, and that means they're evil, as opposed to these fair white blonde tall, right? Right. So, but he's a product of his time, right? You know, 1950s. I mean, as much as he fought the Nazis, like there was a lot of like race. I mean, there was a lot of racism that was just pervasive in those cultures.
You ever heard of the civil rights movement in America?
Right.
That, you know,
right? Yeah. No, I mean that wasn't until 10 years later. So, but anyways, so yeah, enough about Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien is still sort of like he popularized it, right? Like Tolkien made it.
Yeah. Yep.
Tolkien inspired
mainstream
like, this generation of what we call fantasy. Things like before it was, you know, codified as fantasy, it was either mythology or fairy tales or you know, things like that. But like Tolkien has sort of like popularized it into making it this thing that was its own like world, as opposed to just mythological elements of stories in our own world. It's
I want to pull one more like more modern example of fantasy in our world. And that would be Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Kind of an iteration,
Totally.
same kind of vibe, like medieval, set in a modern world even, but like it's the totally magical world is more medieval, whereas the Muggle world is modern day. And so like that's something, because they like don't have as much technology or electricity. They do, but they don't use it like
they don't
in the wizarding world like Muggles do. And so there's this awesome. It's great. Go check it. I mean, who doesn't know who Harry Potter is, right?
Yeah. No. I mean, there's like a lineage, right? After Tolkien, you have this sort of like the Tolkien's heirs, Robert Jordan, and then in Robert Jordan's line, Brandon Sanderson. On the other side, you got George R. R. Martin, J.K. Rowling. Yeah, he inspired so many. Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. Yeah, those guys were also great pillars of, you know, Tolkien's legacy, and it's so much good fantasy out there. So, but why does it work in video games? Why, as a setting, is it like everywhere? Right, like you and I could begin listing off video. Well, we'll save that for a different question, but let's talk about why does it work? What about fantasy is like, you know,
I would start off with just the simple like classes and races. You said species, but in like Harry Potter, there's different classes of wizards. Like, and we talked about elves, orcs, dwarves. You know, like all of those different types of archetypes that you have in a story.
Different gameplay possibilities, right? Because you got your warrior's shield, sword. That's a staple of fantasy, right? And you're having him. He's all open. He plays one way. He's getting the enemy's attention. He's in the face. Allows for that holy trinity: tank, healer, DPS, right? But then you also have the sneaky bandit. That's a whole different play style. You have to have stealth. But spellcasters, wizards, rangers, druids, all that. Like it allows for creating this system of divergent gameplay within the same game, and then of course customization, like you said, with the races and stuff. You can create highly customizable characters that both play and look and feel different, and allow the player, I should say, it allows the player to create their own version of this hero, and it allows the developers to play with a whole bunch of different types of mechanics or art styles that they might not otherwise get to.
And
lots of monsters. Worlds. Yeah, lots of monsters.
Monsters.
Too.
Monsters are good too.
Like it's always nice to not fill your game with a bunch of like humans that you have to go slaughter, because that gets kind of controversial after a while. So if you can just go, we can all agree that it's totally fine to kill dragons or ugly trolls, right? Like, so wholesale slaughter of the native species of these worlds. Why not? Bring it on. Decimate the landscape, if you will. Kill as many boars as you want. It's just a video game, right? and they're each one
Sure.
experience point apiece, so might as well.
Yep. But open worlds, these monsters exist in worlds, like you just mentioned.
Yep.
Like there's an entirely, it's always, fantasy is never Earth, Middle Earth, and I mean Harry Potter is kind of Earth, but there's the Wizarding world, which is entirely a mythological universe or like dimension, if you will. But the landscape's different. It's not actually our Earth. It's something else. It's something entirely
You don't have to
fantastical.
recreate Manhattan street by street. Looking at you, Spider-Man.
Exactly. You can, we have a whole episode about like maps in video games and what that means and the implications of placement of mountains and lakes and forests and all that stuff. But like you have the open world to explore. It leans like the idea of a fantasy in the literary world like makes sense to translate that to a video game where we can freely as a player explore this world as we want. And like the advent of the open world genre is kind of spearheaded by Elder Scrolls, starting back with like Morrowind and Oblivion and
even
Fallout.
Zelda, right? The original Zelda game.
Yeah,
right? Talk about like fantasy game, like trying to do an open world for the first time, an open map, and with what they were capable of at the time. Yeah, that's what essentially Zelda's conceit was: go anywhere, do anything. Obviously, it was still ultimately very linear, but nevertheless, it was a good attempt, right? Just sort of creating this, like, this is a world and here's the map, go. I mean, and now that's been sort of like fully realized by games. You have a whole litany of open world games, in that same vein of fantasy open world games like Skyrim, The Witcher 3, and then the biggest new iterations to that, the next new kind of step forward in open world fantasy games, obviously Breath of the Wild revolutionized that genre. Truly was the full realization of what they started with Zelda 1. And then Elden Ring is, like I think you and I had a conversation, and I said that I think it's the true successor, right? Because even though Red Dead Redemption had similar elements, Red Dead Redemption 2, it was in development like alongside Breath of the Wild because it only came out a year later. Whereas Elden Ring has been in development and just enough time where it could feasibly have been influenced by Breath of the Wild's design, and they actually learned the right lessons. They didn't just take the art style like Genshin Impact did and then slap it onto a gacha game. They actually learned like what made that game successful, which is don't like tell me where to go with waypoints and stuff. Just give me a map and let me explore and find all this stuff. So it's awesome. So that's kind of like where it is. But yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons, right? And for that reason, I actually didn't add this as a question, but we can talk about it. For that reason, I think that fantasy is just wildly overdone, right? Like I could probably pull out my games list, and an embarrassing amount of them would be fantasy games that are more or less indistinguishable from one another, right? Like
it's a lot.
Like look at my Steam library. It's like yeah, how many games, and just count the number of games that have dwarves in them, and that's basically like so yeah, it's it can be overdone, right? To the point where some games have come out within the same year and have been virtually indistinguishable from one another because they're both just fantasy games with elves, dragons, dwarves, and magic. It's like so thoughts on that real quick before we move on?
Yeah, there's droves and droves of games. I mean, you can talk about like just Warhammer has a slew of them, and then like Elder Scrolls has a slew of them, Baldur's Gate has a slew of them.
Oh my gosh.
And then the things that
and
try
those
to
are just
clone
the popular
those
ones.
genres.
Yeah.
Right. Those exactly. There's like all of the indie titles that like draw inspiration from those types of games. You have Blizzard, which is almost entirely fantasy except for StarCraft and
Overwatch.
maybe Heroes of the Storm.
I mean, they've diverged a little bit from it, but yeah, they built their empire on World of Warcraft and Diablo, mostly World of Warcraft, which is fantasy. I mean, League of Legends is kind of fantasy, steampunk with a mix of steampunk fantasy.
Final Fantasy.
Yeah, well, some Final Fantasies, about half the Final Fantasies are rooted firmly in the fantasy genre, whereas like the other half are either steampunk or technopunk or magipunk or straight up sci-fi. And then there's like, I mean, I think of like some of the more niche titles like Kingdoms of Amalur or Divinity Original Sin,
Titan Quest.
Yeah. Pillars of Eternity. Yeah, just like Ultima Online, all that stuff.
Oh,
Richard
Garriott.
I mean, we could just go on and on and on about fantasy games, and so many of them are they're not completely indistinguishable from one another because they all have things that make them unique and fun on their own rights. But man, oh man, has it been a genre that has been just tread to death, to the point where sometimes I get excited about a game like Horizon Zero Dawn that like has similar elements, a hostile world, a lone archer ranger who has to wander her way through a wilderness full of, oh wait, no, they're not monsters. They're robot animal dinosaurs. And like that, it was like, oh, it's so unique and different at the time. it came out, because again, it's like they could have just made it a fantasy game if they wanted to, but they're like, no, let's twist this a little bit. And I always find that something admirable. So cool. Why do some of these games that we talked about that we would consider some of the best, why do they do fantasy well? Like, what about those games? How do they do fantasy differently from one another that still makes it fresh and interesting, right? So does that make sense? So it's like, we talk about like Skyrim and The Witcher. Why do both of those games do fantasy well, and yet why do both of them succeed in that same space as separate games that are still lauded and praised successfully?
Yes, it makes perfect sense, and I can articulate the difference because of my own experience. I
Yeah.
hated Skyrim when it first came out. I then played The Witcher 3, had a moment with open world type of fantasy adventure games, and then went back to Skyrim and genuinely appreciate it for what it was doing and absolutely adore and love it. So I can actually differentiate the two. Skyrim has way more emphasis on role playing, and that is you create your character the way you want. You want to be stealthy, then you have to be stealthy to upgrade your stealth mechanics. If you want to use a bow, you have to use the bow to level up your bow mechanics. When you play The Witcher 3, you are stepping into the shoes of Geralt,
seasoned monster hunter. Yeah, you have a character.
Yes, and he has two swords and a bevy of magic and potions, and he's got a crossbow that you can use, and like that's what you're leveling up and building Geralt the way you would want to. But in Skyrim or Elder Scrolls, you are building yourself, and same with Fallout. And so that's the biggest difference to me. They both operate in the fantasy realm, genre, feel, look, how that works, how it comes together, mechanics, character sheets, stats, building. All of them, there's definitely a 20-sided die going on behind the scenes, RNG, like all of the things that you would experience in like D&D, Dungeons and Dragons are all there under the hood. But what you're seeing and experiencing as the player is very different just by distinguishing between the role-playing aspects of both Skyrim and The Witcher 3.
Yeah. Kind of a lightning round aspect here. Just gonna try to hit a bunch at once and just try to talk about what like makes them unique. Obviously, World of Warcraft, revolutionized the MMO space, right? It was now a fantasy you could go on with your friends, and that's kind of why it worked for it. Even before that, with Warcraft 3, right? Firmly, high fantasy. It was like fantasy StarCraft, right? It was RTS. You really felt like you were commanding a platoon of soldiers in a very, rich world.
StarCraft was their third RTS game.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Warcraft 3 was their fourth. Three Warcraft games and one sci-fi game. So Warcraft 3 was like their bread and butter.
Yeah, for sure. So other fantasy, Diablo loot, right? Like it kind of brought loot and that loot chase and making your character really feel like loot made them more powerful. That kind of is what made it and why it worked in fantasy, right? Because everyone wants to be that hero in fantasy. Let's see. So, we you already talked about Elder Scrolls, hit on that, and The Witcher. Dark Souls, of course, just to briefly mention it, of course, because I have to. Dark fantasy, right? But like, again, making you feel like you're in a world that is like, it is dangerous. In this one, you're not a god. And yet you still challenge and strive and overcome, just like the heroes in those fantasy stories, right? Like Lord of the Rings would be like boring as crap if Frodo just rode the eagles to Mount Doom, right? Like, no, we love the story because he struggled and strived and suffered, right? And so that's built into fantasy stories, and that's built into Dark Souls, and by extension, Elden Ring. Except Elden Ring does it even better because it's bright and colorful, and you really are truly, you're not just on a linear path stuck in claustrophobic corridors. No, you have the whole world. You can go in any direction you want, which is sort of that promise of open world. And we talked about how Zelda revolutionized it as well. I'm trying to think of more fantasy games. Throw me fantasy games.
Dragon Age.
Oh,
BioWare?
Well, all of BioWare's sort of the RPG aspect of it. It shares Divinity and Divinity Original Sin 2. Sorry, Divinity Original Sin and Original Sin 2. Both of them do the same thing where it's like you really are like they really pull from D&D on regards to the sort of like conversation mechanics where you have to actually make conversational decisions that can influence what happens. I think Divinity Original Sin 2 might actually have a like custom campaign mode too, where you can actually make D&D campaigns basically in Divinity Original Sin 2. So we'll circle back around to that for sure. I don't know Pillars of Eternity well enough, but I know that it's super popular from Obsidian and stuff like that. So I mean I feel like despite my complaint that like it's an oversaturated, and there are plenty of fantasy games out there that are just crap, right? That are just garbage because they're not doing something unique enough, or they're just made cheaply and low budget. I have a fondness for Kingdoms of Amalur, but even I can tell that like it's not a great game. So there's plenty out there that suck. So the ones that do fantasy well, it's because they're pulling out some aspect of what we'll segue into. They're pulling out some aspect of what made tabletop gaming so great and still makes tabletop gaming so great. So really quickly, use that as a segue. Let's sort of recap the tabletop. We did a tabletop episode a long time ago. We interviewed our buddy and game master, Nick Peach. And so let's kind of recap some of that and just specifically talking about what impact and legacy has D&D had on the video game industry and video game creation.
Everything. Like, that's like, 1970s was when Dungeons and Dragons first came out. It was like
And
based
sort
on
of
war
super
games and
popular in the
strategy
80s,
games,
yeah.
and of course it drew elements of fantasy. And like the 80s was when it was extraordinarily popular.
Oh, and can we talk for a second that
Yeah.
we get the video game term RPG, role-playing game, comes from Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop RPGs.
Yeah.
It makes so much sense to call those games RPGs because you literally are playing a role. You are acting as your character out in real life because that's all you have is you have cheats and dice, but it's all in your imagination. The entire game is played in your imagination. And so, yeah, it makes sense. You are role-playing. And that makes so much sense. But when we call Zelda a role-playing game, it is, but it's only because it's inspired by D&D and takes these elements from D&D, but it's like, the role you're playing is Link, right?
Even though he's like a silent protagonist that you can kind of impose yourself on, it's like a blank slate. You know, there's room for role playing in there, but like really, it's Link.
Yep, you're not engaging. Very few people, I think, are actually engaging in role play in role playing games, right? I mean, you have the RP servers in World of Warcraft and stuff. And those people are role playing, but it's just so weird that we have co-opted the term RPG because of the elements we're going to talk about that video games take from tabletop RPGs. But it's so much more accurate to describe tabletops as RPGs than video games as RPGs based on the idea of what role play is. So, anyways, carry on.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, let's talk about those elements though. Like, what are the things? Like, what things have video games just straight up taken from D&D and put into game form?
I'm gonna pick a less obvious one. Sure. I think adventuring parties, like groups of folks together. D&D is a co-op game. You play with your friends. You have a game master, and you work together. Sometimes you will do stupid things like Dan, who wants to start a bar fight second one of our Pathfinder round. But, sometimes you work together. It's a party. How many role-playing games do we play that have parties involved? And I know like Dragon Age has a party system. Knights of the Old Republic, BioWare has a party system. Final Fantasy, it's always a group. It's so all the MMOs, all the right? Raids. I mean, even down to like more modern shooters like Destiny having a party, Outriders, like those things all like derive from Dungeons and Dragons role playing. It's the idea of partying together. It's like you embody the role of like the whole group as opposed to an individual, like Skyrim, which is a single player game.
We've talked about some of the more obvious ones too, loot and leveling up. We had a whole episode on experience XP, right? Stat sheets, stats in general, right? Like the idea of building a character and having to make choices as to where you invest your points. That's so 100, and even those basic fundamental points, right? Like the basic fundamental categories. There's always some like brute strength, brawn, body. There's always something separately related to health and like your character's ability to survive or endurance, stuff like that. There's always a stat related to magic and spells, and it's almost always mind, intellect. It's always associated with like knowledge and learning and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like Final Fantasy is really good, speaking of magic, of like distinguishing the different types. White mage, healer, right? And does party buffs. And then black mage does damage, lightning, fire, ice. Blue wizard like takes on enemy skills and learns them as their own. And so you have like a hybrid red mage, which does like is the spell like sword wielder that does spells, but also is a fighter, a warrior. And so you have a defender, the warrior, the magician, you have the class system. It's in MMOs. Now you have DPS, tank, healer kind of paradigms are all derived from fantasy Dungeons and Dragons.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So, gosh, and we could go on, right? There's so many. In fact, we're going to like stumble across things too. Oh, the whole dialogue thing, the whole like,
dialogue choices?
You get to choose, dialogue choices, and you get to kind of choose how this story goes. Or even just the idea of like beginning to build your character and be good or bad, right? Like I guess that goes to dialogue choices, but the morality systems too, like, oh, you're punished for doing the bad choices, or maybe not punished, but like it'll like reflect in your character, like all that alignment stuff, that's comes from that company. Literally, there are alignments in Dungeons and Dragons, and like depending on how you align your character, right? There's I'm sure our listeners are familiar with the chaotic, lawful,
Oh yeah,
good,
yep.
evil spectrum, right?
Neutral,
And the neutral, right? Good, evil,
chaotic, neutral.
neutral, chaotic, neutral, or lawful, and how that's a spectrum. And those alignments, yeah, I mean, literally, like when you're playing, your dungeon master might be like, that's not a choice. Like if you make that choice, it's going to put you in chaotic alignment or whatever, and you'll lose access to spells or abilities that require you to have a certain alignment, right? So like, again, the idea that like your morality will actually influence the way that your character functions is totally from D&D. So I mean, really, tabletops were foundational to our understanding of role-playing games, to the point where they also kind of typed out, right, like predicted, so to speak, the mechanics that we would see in video games to this
It's
day.
also cool
So
to see how like D&D inspired tabletop games, D&D
Mhm.
inspired video games, but then
Uh-huh.
to see the influence of video games on tabletop games and like see how the
Yeah,
trifecta come together. Because like Gloomhaven, for example, if you've played Gloomhaven, it's a pretty modern, came out a couple years ago, tabletop RPG that's like D&D boiled down to something you can play. It's a legacy game you play over a campaign. Well, the idea of a campaign started with D&D, but obviously video games continue that on, where your choices affect the world. You can't go back. You've changed. You made this decision. You've locked yourself out of content. Like that happens in video games. And so you see that like how the character's abilities, how they level up, the kind of gear they can equip has like, you can just see all that coming together. And like, I think that's awesome to see three different avenues with which to experience that content, and that all have different interpretation of the same stuff that are all unique to their medium. It's a lot of fun. It's really, really cool.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, cool. Then what games do you think like are the best heirs, so to speak, of D&D? Like what games do you think are like the ones that best capture the magic of D&D, or otherwise put a meaningful twist on the experience that results in an equally satisfying homage or game, right? So what I mean by that is like, so on the one, there's two categories I want to see here. On the one hand, I want to see games that are like, okay, these games really capture the feeling you get while playing D&D, like are closest to it. And then what games do you think put a meaningful enough twist on it where it's like, okay, this is a clever, like they're doing a clever thing with like what D&D inspired. So it's clearly inspired by D&D, but it's doing its own thing in a way that's still fun, satisfying, and possibly an homage. So obviously that second category, the one that comes to mind, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep, is sort of an example of that second one, right? Where it's like taking the elements of like a D&D experience and then telling its own fun Borderlands-y looter shooter tale in that space. So you have your dungeon master as Tiny Tina, and she's like screwing with you in the same way that a DM would in an actual D&D game. So even though the game plays nothing like what I would expect a D&D campaign to play like, it still feels like you're actually playing D&D. So I guess that's my example. What are other games that do that well, versus what are games that you think are actually like good kind of like implementations of what D&D was doing?
I haven't played it, but apparently Divinity Original Sin 2
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
is like the epitome of our modern era of games that capture what D&D was trying to do.
Yeah.
And that is
it's good
like,
in that space, but for that reason
yeah,
also, I was like, oh my gosh, it's also 200-hour platinum, right?
right.
It can be a
It's a
tedious
lot
game
of
to get through.
content. Yeah. And in my history of gaming, like Baldur's Gate, I played a little Icewind Dale. Shout
Oh
out to Jimothy.
yeah, all those
Like
games,
Baldur's Gate
man.
was
Mhm.
it. I mean, like that was
I mean, it's
the
made by Wizards of the
translation.
Coast, which also
Yeah.
now publishes D&D. So yeah.
Yeah. Definitely a good translation. You have the party system. You have crazy amounts of dialogue. It's deep lore. It has character sheets. Obviously, the 20-sided die is under the hood. It has everything you would want from D&D without having to except that it's single player. And that's where like co-op games, I think MMOs are
I
really,
would
really
say
good
like,
at capturing.
yeah, old World of Warcraft, man, totally gives you that experience. Because back in the old days, like it had the stakes, right? It had that sort of like you died and you would actually like it would hurt, right? And so I mean that's what
Mm-hmm.
happens in D&D. So in that vein, I have to give Dark Souls credit as well. Like the whole Souls franchise, including Elden Ring, is like I mean, stats matter. Every individual point you get in a stat, it's like, oh, thank God, right? Like because everything feels so much more like it matters, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
same feeling that I certainly got in D&D. Because you're right. I began our Pathfinder experience sort of like treating it like a video game. Like, there's not going to be that bad of a consequences if I. But then I was like gimped going into the dungeon because I had taken so much damage in the bar fight. Right? I was like, oh man, like that was actually a bad. I'll admit it now. It was a fun choice, but man, it might not have been the right choice. And that's kind of like the idea there is like, oh man, the stakes are real. It's so easy to just like, I thought I was like, I'm gonna throw my axe because I'm a BA, and like my axe missed. Whoops. Wait, I rolled a 5 and my axe still missed. Yeah, it didn't just like
Mm,
not do damage, like a lot of damage, but still hit them. No, it just
it's
missed them
entirely
because
gone.
it didn't
Nothing.
meet the threshold that needed. Like, it's very punishing. It's very, very, and so, for that reason, I'd say early World of Warcraft before they really started to gamify it a lot more. And yeah, the Souls games are kind of also that kind of legacy there, where it's just like, yeah, it's a big deal when you lose.
Yep.
So, but then the flip side of that, though, is because the stakes are so high, every single little upgrade, every stat point you get, you just reached a stat threshold so you can use a new spell. Ooh, doggy. It's on now. You got a new weapon from a boss that dropped. Like, yeah, everything feels so much more rewarding when you actually get it. So I think those games are as well. But yeah, I feel like Divinity is probably the quintessential one there, but I also got to give those games some credit.
Yeah.
For the
And
way that
I
they're set.
love the Elder Scrolls entire
Oh, yeah.
franchise.
Mhm,
All of them
mhm.
have done a wonderful job at like bringing the D&D feel to a single player experience in
Yeah,
their own
Elder Scrolls
ways.
is always. Yeah, I don't love the games, or I still don't to this day have a lot of love for Skyrim, only because my experience with it was just meh. But what I loved about it was this feeling of being in a world and really getting to chart my own path. Like, they do kind of guide you in the way that a lot of those like Ubisoft games do, but not nearly as aggressively. And they're totally fine if you go off the beaten path. They will
Mhm.
punish you if you go somewhere you're not supposed to. But that can be fun, right? Like, that can be an adventure. And so I always felt like Skyrim was like, okay, like they want me to go adventure through this world, and chart my own course and discover stuff, right? So Skyrim really started that trend, I think, or popularized it in a big way. I agree.
Mhm. I want to add a question maybe.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
How have video games detracted from the essence of D&D
Yeah,
while
that's a
trying
good.
to
Yeah.
purify it
Sure.
or
Yeah. No,
like
that is
use it?
definitely, yeah. Like, so so basically it's kind of the flip of this question. Like, how have they sort of like failed to implement it and then sort of watered down the experience, right? Yeah. I mean, games can never, well, again, difficulty, right? Like, those tabletop games can be pretty unforgiving. If you mess up, you have to like start your character all over again if you die, right? While
Mhm.
in the middle of a party, like your character has to like awkwardly rejoin, like a new character rejoins the party. That's conveniently named the same as your other character, but with the number 2 after it or whatever, right? Like, uh, so yeah, I think that like sometimes the whole like you can destroy the D&D experience by like having it so that it the characters get too powerful and it doesn't feel like things matter, right? Whatever, the cool, epic, legendary piece of gear just dropped, whatever. I've got like 15 million of them in my bank, right? Like, so as great as Diablo was, like that kind of like over looting trend, I do think it doesn't capture the same feel as D&D does, where like every piece of loot is like a big deal. Cause like, even if you can't use it, oh, I can sell it and then I can use that to go buy stuff I actually want, right? Like, that's all very much built into the tabletop experience. Whereas in video games, it depends on the game, but sometimes it's very much like, yeah, use it or lose it, who cares, right? So, and if the classes don't feel particularly powerful, or if you don't feel connected to your party, which is many games, or the NPCs, right? Like, a good DM in a tabletop game will make you feel connected to the characters in the world, even though the non-player characters. But like, there's so many video games I've played where I'm like, I don't give a crap about these people or their lives.
Yep.
So, yeah. So, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about like the over gamification. You talked about like the difficulty
Mhm.
curve of an actual D&D game where the stakes are higher, everything matters, but also the insignificance of a level up,
Yeah.
seemingly insignificance of a level up. If you only ever knew D&D, you only ever played that, and you first played a video game, and you'd be like, "Oh, I've leveled up 6 times in the last 20 minutes. Wow, I can spend all
Yeah.
these points. I'm
Yeah.
so strong." You just have this godlike feeling. It's because the video games have like dabbled into the like what is it, that dopium drip, where it's just like
Yeah. Yep.
constantly trying to
Dopamine.
make
Yep.
the player excited and keep playing
Dopamine.
an engagement over and over again really quickly within a play session, where like D&D at its core is supposed to take 3 hours, 4 hours over the course of a night, and you get one level,
Yeah.
and you
Well,
can raise your
yeah.
stat one
Yep.
stat
Yeah.
point,
Well, and
and you get
leveling
maybe
is the game, right? Like that we talked about that in the I think we talked about that when we talked about like XP and leveling up. Like leveling is the game in those games. Like you said, your whole point is to get through the missions that you can get a level, right? Whereas in video games turned it into leveling was just the precursor to it was the tutorial to the end game. I kind of blame World of Warcraft for this in a lot of ways too, where it's just like even in Diablo, you still you never really reached max level, and you could still do all the the cool stuff in Diablo and get all the cool gear and use it. World of Warcraft, you literally couldn't see like 60% of the game's content if you were not max level and like pushing that content at max level. Like you had to get to end game, and that was the real game, right? Leveling was just sort of the mini game you did to warm up for it. Whereas like the spirit of tabletops is like, no, the leveling is all you're doing, right? Like it is the game, and you never win that. You just keep trying to get stronger as you go, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was
So
good.
I
That was
think,
good,
yeah,
Ashwin.
video
Yeah.
games just gamify the thing and kind of cheapen the
Absolutely.
experience if you look at it that way.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
here we are, 40 years into video games, and we've had hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of fantasy video games, many of which were trying to chase after that D&D feel, right? Why? I guess, Dungeons is the question, right? Dungeons and Dragons has been around for almost 50 years or more, and video games have been around for almost as long, but didn't really take off in popularity to this caliber until, probably about 30, 40 years ago. So then my question is like, why chase after D&D? What is it about the D&D experience that inspired game makers to do that, but with pixels and programming?
There's a lot of, we can come at this entire topic of discussion, but you look at D&D at its core and what it is. There's a lot of pain points around it. How accessible is it? How much time do you have to spend on it? How often can you attend? What does
One
the
person at
commitment look
least
like?
needs to know everything about it, or
Yeah,
at least
game
figure out
mastering
how to
is
figure
a
it out. Yeah.
crazy burden. Like
Yep.
writing your own scenarios and laying out the course, then the artists, the marketing, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of that can be computerized and automated to like AI and how you interact with. So like obviously that has happened, but also the core human experience of what you get out of a D&D group of a campaign, they want to preserve that and also evolve with it. Everything about our society is different. Technology is different. How often people work, how long hours people work. Family has changed drastically since the 1980s. Family life, two working parents is kind of the norm. I guess it started in the 80s. It was the whole like latchkey kids, Gen Xers, etc. Like that started. So the Gen Xers were the ones that were out playing D&D. It's their parents are working all the time, but now those kids have grown up and they're the ones working, but also still want to live that childhood or like continue that line that they experienced as kids in a nostalgic way. But everything looks different now. We all have our own kids and we have our own commitments. And so video games make a wonderful way to tweak and change and interpret all of what D&D was doing differently and different experiences and like unique experiences. And so it makes sense that you take this core idea of building a character with gear. You can gamify everything, even to the nefarious ways of microtransactions, of like cosmetics and what you look like, all the way up to like the more complex party systems that you would see in like MMOs and 40 people raids, etc. You can approach this whole idea of what D&D was doing from so many different angles that it does make complete sense that after 40 years of what D&D had started, we're now an internet connected society. We were not then. So we have the online platform. We have the ability to play real time with anyone around the world. That expands our entire market, like whatever you would call the market share, the player base, to grab parties. It's so easy now that like when World of Warcraft implemented the finder, the party finder, like that was a game changer because like suddenly you're just thrown into random pickup groups, pugs, and like that was looked down on at one point, but actually it was a wonderful like feature for those of us who didn't have the time to like commit to a weekly.
Actually, it was highly
night.
well received at the time, and then
it was amazing.
Became something that people realized.
Well,
oh, this kind of took something from the game. The game's not the same as a result of this.
Yep.
It wasn't just that. It was that in combination with several other changes that slowly over time eroded that sense of community. Had it just been that, things might have been okay still, but It was a combination of things. So nevertheless, you're right. Yeah, though it did certainly change the mindset being like, let's make this available to people instead of having to like spend all their time just like, oh, you've got 2 hours of gameplay a night. You might very well spend an hour and a half of that just looking for a party, and then you got half an hour. Can you fit a whole dungeon in that
awful.
time? No,
Yeah.
you can't.
It was awful.
So there
But I
certainly
think,
is
like,
sort of like a not leveling up, a maturing of gaming that it has its toll, right? But at the same time, there's also plenty of people who just don't have time to play games, and yet they should still have access to meaningful experiences in the time they have. That is certainly a philosophy around games that has changed in the last 20 years or so.
And what we have seen since 2007, in the last 5 years, with the advent of Breath of the Wild, is it seems like there are so many different aspects of D&D that are at play here that the technology enables a certain aspect of D&D to flourish, and that's where we saw the open world model, which, yes, the seeds were sown through games like Elden Ring, obviously, Elder Scrolls and Fallout and like those things, but then you see like something truly different.
They were open world games.
Those were the seeds that were planted.
But there was an iteration. They were full blown plants. But certainly, I think that Zelda's sort of the perfection. It's that like, okay, yep, we finally kind of hit what D&D hit on, 50 years ago, and yet now we're finally able to do it in video games because, like you said, the technology is there where you can then say, and if I look into a D&D scenario and it's like, oh, I've got access to bombs and there's a bunch of barrels on top of that. If you took a Zelda Breath of the Wild like scenario, but like copy and pasted it into the D&D scenario where it's like, I've got bombs and I've got the ability to glide and and the enemies have explosive barrels on top of their little base here. Let me hit like an updraft that's right around. Oh no, light the grass on fire, hit an updraft, glide over their base, drop a bomb, boom, explosions.
Yep.
Like that is something you could like, again, it's that thinking of that creative solution to problems. I think that is really what Zelda pulls from D&D. My favorite D&D story, I think I mentioned this in our D&D episode, was the guy who figured out that any living creature that you kill in D&D in that edition originally, it's one of those legendary stories in there, would be 1 experience point. So he asked his DM, he's like, I'm gonna do a observation check for an anthill, and the DM's like, I don't know where you're going with this, but sure, you roll whatever. Okay, you passed. You find an anthill. Can I boil some water? Yeah, do a skill check. I'm not sure where you're going with this, but sure, do a skill check. This low skill threshold to pass. Okay, you passed it. Great. You rolled a 3, whatever. So he boiled water, and then he's like, I pour the boiling water on the anthill. How many ants are in the anthill? And how much experience do I get? And he goes, oh, crap. So, like that creative solution to problems is what Breath of the Wild was finally technologically able to catch up to with D&D. Because D&D just doesn't imagine it in your imagination, right? So,
yeah. So I wouldn't the way that you phrase the question, like games are chasing after the D&D experience. I wouldn't say that.
No,
I would just say that games are evolving or doing the D&D experience continuously for 40 years.
They're pulling out different aspects of it. Cool. All right. Well, I guess that's where we can end. We want to hear what your thoughts are. Are you a big D&D fan? Are you a big video game fan? I would imagine you are the latter, at least if you're listening to the podcast. So what are your thoughts on fantasy games and specifically that legacy of D&D that's had on it? So we want to hear those thoughts, or we want to hear, are you just like, nope, I only ever play sports games and every once in a while I dabble into like some hard sci-fi, some EVE Online. Like hit us up. We want to talk to you about it, because guess what, there's a lot of overlap with that and fantasy and D&D, so we can still sneak this conversation in no matter what angle you come at us from, except for maybe sports games, although I'm sure we could stretch it if we really wanted to. So those thoughts and more, Termite, where can
tell us do it? Why you think D&D 3.5 is the quintessential D&D. Also, tell us why you think NASCAR spotters are like raid leaders, and you can do that at 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website where you can talk all about how sports is essentially a D&D raid. Let us know. You have links to all of our social media outlets: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, as well as a Discord server. And you can interact with us individually, one-on-one, as a group, however you would like. It's all there. Have it your way, just like Burger King. Whatever you want, whatever flavor you would like.
Those
80-bit
like wizard
Podsmash
masks in Elden Ring look like the Burger King.
Oh, yes, they do. Thank you for drawing that. Comparison could not place what they look like, but they were so familiar. That is totally the Burger King.
The Burger King.
Especially that Xbox 360 game they came out with, like the King Kart Racer or whatever the crap.
Yeah. I can't claim credit for it. I saw that on Reddit, but
it's perfect.
All
right, thank you.
Yeah, so enjoy Tiny Tina's Wonderlands this week. I really hope it's good. It lives up to the hype. I'm hoping that they learned the right lessons from a writing point of view. For
a lot of good reception out there. Go check it out.
It looks pretty good so far. People are excited about it. Early previews and all that. So I'm looking forward to it. I've got it pre-ordered officially from Amazon in this case because I had some credit. And so so that was what inspired this episode, along with the other episodes that we're doing this week. Thank all centered around March 25th.
Yeah.
So, anyways, so look forward to that, and hope y'all grab a copy and join me some co-op. Other than that, next week just happens to be the beginning of April. I don't know what's special about the beginning of April. So we'll probably have a topic that's completely unrelated. Termite. Yes. We're going to have an episode on April 4th, so obviously not April Fool's because it's not April 1st, so it's fine, right? It's fine. Nothing's happening. There may not even be an episode at all. Who knows? Whatever. It's all mysterious because it's April Fool's. So join us next week or not. And we'll see you
will see you next week or not.